Thank you for taking the time to watch this video called Reducing the Risk of Child, Youth, and Vulnerable Adult Sexual Abuse. It's not an easy topic for some of us, but it is so vital for our congregations. So thank you for sharing this time, and I pray that it will open up a conversation in your congregation as well, if you're watching it with others or you decide to share it with them. The resources that I'm utilizing throughout this training include safe sanctuaries, reducing the risk of abuse in the church for children and youth, and reducing the risk. These are both available through our Western District Conference Resource Library. Our librarian would be happy to send you these resources by mail if you're at a distance, or if you're local, stop in and pick them up. I'm going to share some stories to begin with of a very naive Pastor Kathy. This is just to say there are reasons we need safe sanctuary, safe church policies, and best practices in place, because some of us need all the help we can get. When I was a young youth sponsor, while I was in seminary, my husband and I took our junior high youth group to Chicago for a long weekend. There was a lovely church that acted as our host, and that was not the problem. There were two issues. One, today, my husband and I are related by marriage, of course, and that's not considered a best practice. We should have had at least one other unrelated adult with us. And then there was the Saturday night game of what I call backward hide and seek. One person hides and everybody else seeks them. And once someone finds the person who's hidden, they hide with them. And they continue. People continue hiding together until we have all smashed into one tiny little space together. That certainly encourages unhealthy touch. Maybe not on purpose, but I see other games that would be more appropriate than that one these days. When I was in seminary, I was living in a duplex. There were 7 of us living in both halves, and we offered a gift to our seminary professors saying, would you like to take your spouse out for a night with no children? We would be happy to take care of your children for an evening. That was a lovely offer, and lots of professors took us up on it. As I think about that today, I say, thanks be to God, no one was hurt. Thanks be to God, we had no medical information written down. We hadn't even had conversations with the parents of these 15 children about what kind of foods they might be allergic to, or to call if the parent wasn't available, who was their the next person we should call on their emergency list. No emergency contact information whatsoever. Again, we're very grateful the children were okay, but it was not by any of our good planning. Story was early on in my first pastorate. My husband and I had a group of youth that we were leading their Sunday school, and they all had donuts on the brain. And we said, that's okay. We can go to the local donut shop this morning. Didn't ask the parents, just took the kids to the local donut shop. Short ways away from the church, but that's not the point. If there had been a situation, or even just as a sign of trust, we should have talked with the parents ahead of time. We were talking about Jesus. We were having some great faith conversations, but that was not a safe way in which to do that. So there are things I wish I'd learned sooner, and things I have learned along the way. I will do some things differently today. Let's hear from Jesus and about the place that children have in Jesus' heart when he was in ministry on earth, and the place that children have in God's heart and in our churches today. From Matthew 18, at that time the disciples came to Jesus. They asked him, then who is the most important person in the kingdom of heaven? Jesus called a little child over to him. He had the child stand among them. Jesus said, "What I'm about to tell you is true. You need to change and become like little children. If you don't, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Anyone who takes the humble position of this child is the most important in the kingdom of heaven. Anyone who welcomes a little child like this one in my name welcomes me. What if someone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin? If they do, it would be better for them to have a huge millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the bottom of the sea. How terrible it would be for the world because of the things that cause people to sin. Things like that must come. But how terrible for the person who causes them. Jesus cares about children, cares deeply. And so we need to bear this in mind, how important, how precious our children are as gifts of God. And that's how Jesus saw them too. Trigger warning now. If you are a survivor of abuse, you are welcome to stay and listen to this training as long as you wish. If something does trigger you and you need to take some time away and do some self-care, please do that. If you want to return, of course you're welcome. If you don't, that's okay too. It is not my intention to trigger anyone, but the nature of this training will have some triggering moments for some of us. So why is the church at risk? Well, simply put, we trust each other. Churches are pretty trusting organizations. Blind trust can get us into trouble. If we simply say something like, we're all Christians here, why shouldn't we trust each other? I would like to say that I've learned a lot about sexual abuse predators in the last several years. And I have begun to appreciate Jesus, some other words of Jesus. Be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. We're called to be kind and not naive, as my younger self was. Our theology also emphasizes forgiveness and reconciliation. We need to have a theological understanding that is as deep as the needs of those around us. Forgiveness is a process. Reconciliation, if and when that can come, is a process. It is a way we deepen in our spiritual walk. It is not something we can ever force on someone. Forgiveness and reconciliation must be willingly given when a person is ready to do that. Survivors have said too often they have felt forced into a position of saying, I forgive you. And that's not what they need. They need the space to seek God's healing among the people of faith within their own and the Holy Spirit's timing. Another reason the church is at risk is we fear negative exposure. But I'd like to point out that, in most other organizations, in our culture, schools, medical facilities, the Boys and Girl Scouts, sports teams, music groups, all of these groups in our culture that have children as the focus of their activities, they all have policies and procedures in place to address reducing the risk of child sexual abuse. It is so important. I'm going to share as a deepening of our conversation why sexual abuse in faith communities is so important by showing this video clip from Reducing the Risk. There are going to be 3 experts, 2 psychologists, and 1 insurance claim receiver, a person who receives credible allegations of abuse. And they all have important things to say. Now, this looks a little dated. I get that, but don't allow the dated visuals on this video to keep you from hearing the legitimate concerns that are still quite relevant in our day.
Responsibility for protecting children. So, what can a church do to safeguard the kids in their care? Well, we gathered a group of experts who deal with preventing and responding to child sexual abuse cases. We'll hear from Roger Duffield, Ron Ercole, Steve Henney, Michael Bland, and our facilitator, Peter Persuti. Here's what they had to say.
Maybe the first question is, why do we have sex offenders in our church communities?
You boil it down to the fact that we live in a broken and fallen world. The reality is anybody has the potential to move down a pathway that is not healthy, that does not respect the boundaries of other individuals, and slowly move themselves to a path where they could harm another individual.
It's first important to state the reality. Sexual offenders are part of all faith communities. Child sexual abuse has become a household term.
One of the cases that I had that we've recently been involved in, the gentleman had worked at the daycare worker, or as a daycare center for about 3 years. The reason was he'd gotten divorced, he wanted to be near his son, and they had done a little bit of a background check, but not a full background check. And then 3 years into it, about 5 years ago, over a summer period of time, they moved the room that the kids were in to a back area where they couldn't observe and walk by and make sure that nothing was going on. And that's when the abuse took place. When I look at it, from my experience, I still have kind of a hard time believing that this guy was a perpetrator or a pedophile, because he just didn't show any of those types of traits prior to that. But he pled guilty, and he's sitting in jail for life now because of that incident.
When I came on staff, I kind of put on that offender eye and thought, where would I go? And I knew that we had our children's ministries kind of covered, and we were screening them, and stuff. I wouldn't go there. I'd go to a ministry or some other place where minors are serving. Not where they're being served, like in a child's ministry, but where they are serving, especially the teenagers. And there's a high rate of abuse of teenagers that is often not reported. We always think about the little children, but teenagers are often more susceptible, and anyone of a number of ways. We could talk about it in terms of, rage and anger, all the way to the point of sexual abuse.
Most offenders know their victims. It is not strangers abusing children.
Yeah.
It is people who are known to them. So if the offender is looking for a child-friendly environment where good works is rewarded, where it's a community environment, where interaction with children is encouraged, and they can have easy access, we're somewhat talking about the church. In any denomination, offenders look for child-nurturing environments, and faith communities are child-nurturing.
Does anybody want to comment maybe about why you think there is an uptick in claims? Is it any different from 20 years ago in terms of the offenses or whatever?
I don't know that I see an uptick in claims, but I mirror exactly what you've said, Steve, is we see it less with clergy and more with staff and personnel and even volunteers. What we see is kind of somebody doesn't go in through the normal system. They may be a part-time worker or volunteer just going to help out with this program. They kind of bypass the regular protocols, either out of convenience or need or what have you, and that's where we're seeing our issues.
The reason why we are experiencing an increase in claims or an increase in allegations is simply because of awareness. Both children and parents have been taught to be able to talk about sexual abuse, to be able to talk about feeling uncomfortable when someone touches them or grooms them. They first groom the children to be able to say they're a good person, that they can be friendly, maybe you could bend the rules with me a little bit, maybe you could, use dirty language, or we could go off by ourselves, or I'll give you rewards or gifts or presents without your parents knowing. But at the same time, offenders groom the adult community around them as well.
Exactly.
That they are often very charismatic people, very giving people, very genuine people who have a lot of gifts and talents to share within a community, and therefore most faith communities welcome them. And even within that, I know in various communities that I've been involved in, some of them have said, well, you know, I've done this for so many years, why don't they trust me now? Or this isn't right, or of course I should be able to do this. And I think the answer has to be twofold. Yes, it is out of the reality of sexual abuse, and yes, it is to keep children safe. But I think we have to stop and acknowledge it keeps the adults safe.
Absolutely.
Because although it's a very small percentage, there are some false allegations. And if there's a second adult present who is not related, who is just in a ministry with someone, can say, I was there and you were not alone with a child. So the two-adult rule is not only for the safety of children, it is for the safety of the congregation as well as the individual adults involved.
It's one thing to have good ideas, but if you don't have a structure in place that really keeps the ball moving forward and keeps that issue of protection alive, it will eventually die out.
One of the things we wanted to talk about was this whole issue of the damages, and the damages could begin with you, Steve, relative to the quantifiable aspects.
A lot of this has not been covered. So overall, though, just to use an example, the Catholic Church has probably paid out in excess of $2 billion. This takes away money from the church that they could use for other stewardships that the church would have. And I don't think people really take that into full appreciation. And then I think there really is almost a non-monetary type of aspect to this, too, that I don't think gets factored in. And that's, you know, parishioners or attendees of the church becoming disillusioned with what's going on and the fact that they don't feel their church has addressed it properly, and therefore they're leaving the church and they're maybe going to a different denomination. You know, you can quantify a lot of this, but there's also a lot of non-quantifiable.
When we start looking at the rippling effect, it does affect then a whole congregation, not only financially, but emotionally and from a faith base. You know, we start asking the famous questions of what if and why, and there's not always answers. In our own faith communities and in our ministries, I would say if we are able to identify that child sexual abuse is a reality in our society, even if it's not one of our ministers or clergy persons doing the abuse, fathers, stepfathers, uncles, our church members are being abused. And what are we going to do about it? And in our faith communities, what we have to be able to present is that child sexual abuse will not be tolerated in our faith communities.
A lot of times, allegations that come forward or concerns that volunteers may have aren't about something that's happening with one of the volunteers, but a child comes in with a bruise, or they seem to be acting differently. And it's not just a particular bruise, but it may be, especially in terms of a pattern. This child always seems to be coming in with bruises, or, you know, used to be very happy and outgoing, and now they're quiet, and now they're fearful of certain people, maybe within the ministry. I don't want to be near that person. Can I go be a part of this group or something else? With adolescents, you may see a host of different kinds of things, a lot more acting out behavior, getting promiscuous or cutting themselves, ways that they're basically trying to say, something's wrong, I don't know how to handle this, help me, see my signs.
Child sexual abuse is not denominational. It is a public health issue. It is looking for leaders for a solution in keeping children safe, reaching out to victims and survivors, and identifying offenders. The church of every denomination that faces the reality of child sexual abuse is losing a lot of their stewardship in their money, in their resources, in their faith, and in their credibility. And that's why we have to realize that this is a public health issue that is crying out for a leader, and let that leader be our faith communities.
If you want to pause the video, if you're watching it with other people in your congregation, you're welcome to do so. There was a lot to talk about in that video. In the meantime, let's continue on. Why is the church at risk? Well, even in our hypersexualized world with TV and internet sexuality on display, we are still uncomfortable in the church a lot of the time in talking about what healthy sexuality looks and sounds like. Opportunities in our congregation for close contact and personal relationships exist. I think particularly of mentor-mentee relationships. These can be so vital and so enriching to the young person who has another adult besides their parents they can trust. And at the same time, that is an incredibly potentially risk-filled behavior. So we need to have even more specialized safe sanctuary or safe church best practices in place for those specialized ministries. We lack training in healthy personal boundaries. We don't allow our kids to say no to touch. If somebody wants to hug them, we say, go hug Aunt Millie. Or we make them feel guilty without saying much. Circle of Grace is a great resource to consider if you want to allow your kids in your congregation to learn what and who to allow into their circle of grace, where the Holy Spirit is with them and where they recognize those that are safe and those that make them feel uncomfortable. And so they learn to go to a trusted adult to talk about that if the need arises. Pastors, continuing on in healthy personal boundary, pastors, those that are credentialed, receive healthy boundaries training, and we would open that up to other leaders if your congregation would like to have a broader healthy boundaries training. There is a basic boundaries training that I have. It's about a 25-minute video that you can find on YouTube, or I would be happy to send you the link if you want to start a conversation about what healthy boundaries look like and why it's so important to have boundaries in our lives. One of my boundary questions that I learned when I was in ministry fairly early on was learning to not give more energy to somebody else's problem than they were willing to give to their own issue. That's an emotional boundary and maybe a time boundary too. All right, so ultimately, why are children, youth, and vulnerable adults at risk in the church? All of these factors I've been sharing lead to one reason. In summary, the church is at risk because our children, those who would perpetrate harm on our children, have easy access to them in relation to other places in our culture. I'm going to share some statistics now. This is hard to hear, but we need to know what the reality is. And the reality is that abuse happens. 1 in 6 boys will be sexually exploited by age 18, and 1 in 4 girls will be. That may be because there really is a difference in the number of children that are girls versus boys, or it may be that a similar number of all genders of children are exploited, but boys are acculturated to act brave, to not share their fears. 93% of children will know their attacker. This is not about stranger danger on the whole. It's about kids knowing a family friend, someone in their own family. There are some statistics here from the state of Kansas, because that's who I was sharing this with most recently. But I encourage you to get your own, do your research, get your own state statistics, how many people are on the state registered sex offenders, or your county. How many registered sex offenders do you have in your county? the number of sex offenders in the US, at least as of early 2023, is 786,000 in the US. Now, mind you, these are people who are actually on the registry, which means they were actually caught, they were actually charged. So there are many, many more perpetrators out there who have not been caught. Or if they have, they've been let go and may or may not go back to their practice. Single moms are particularly vulnerable to a pedophile's actions. I think that makes sense. Single moms are, doing their best they can to protect their little ones. And they also appreciate it when there are those who seem to take a special interest in their child. And particularly if it's a male and they have a boy, they may want that male as a role model in their child's life. So we need to recognize when it is truly care from a well-meaning person, or when it is grooming by a person who wants to receive that child's trust and the churches and the parents. So they may assault a child. Children with disabilities are 4 to 10 times more vulnerable to sexual abuse than those who are more abled. Perhaps that's because the child can't articulate, they can't share what has happened to them with speech, or they do share it and are not believed because of who they are and their limitations. 2 out of 3 molesters who are caught will abuse again in the future. And a typical pedophile abuser will molest 117 children in their lifetime. But this isn't just adult pedophiles, adult abusers. 1 in 5 molesters begin their activity before the age of 18. So we heard those experts around the round table talking about teens needing to be supervised for sure, because it's not, they are equally at risk of being assaulted and being the ones who might begin to abuse. The biggest users of online pornography are 11 to 17-year-olds. They want to know, they have sexual curiosity, and that is somewhere they can go. Now, 1 in 4 sexual assault cases are committed by minors. 1 in 4 committed by kids under 18 on kids. Children are most vulnerable to sexual assault between 7 and 13. So we really do need to pay attention to how we are utilizing our teen volunteers. They need to be overseen by adults. The last troubling thing is that only 12% of child sexual abuse is reported to authorities. Only 12%. That is likely because children know their attackers, their abusers, and it's really hard for families or close friends to turn each other in to the authorities, even though it's necessary. An estimated 60 million sexual abuse survivors are in the US today. And of course, that means there are likely, highly likely, that we have adult survivors in our churches. The highest risk setting for abuse to potentially happen is an overnight activity with male workers. Think of my husband and I in Chicago with our junior high youth group. Blessedly, both of us are very committed to child safety, but that's an example. We did not have a third adult with us, and so it would have been open. We would have been open to allegations. The children would have been open to harm if that would have been our intent. Another danger zone, older youth giving full supervision to younger children without an adult supervising them. For instance, in a vacation Bible school class or the church nursery. Let's allow our youth to be involved in the life of the community. If they do want to work with kids, that's terrific. have an adult with them. Remember, the goal is not to create paranoia or unhealthy suspicion, but to raise awareness of the risks that can be within our churches by the very nature of our being together. We want to demonstrate a high standard of care to the most vulnerable, as Jesus did, and take our victim survivors seriously. Whatever we do to protect the least of these, we are also doing to protect ourselves from false allegations and to be survivor-centered. I will say at this point that it is a very, very small percentage of false allegations, but they do happen. It is between 2 and 8% of all credible allegations that turn out to be false. You can look that up online and find those, find research that backs that up. But I want to give you a comparison, if you will. If that seems like a lot to you, by comparison, 10% of all reports of auto accidents turned out to be fraudulent. Generally speaking, we don't quit believing people when they say they've been in a car accident. Why would we not believe someone who said that they had been abused? And speaking of that, let's hear the firsthand account of a survivor's story. This is, again, where I want those of you who are survivors of abuse to take care of yourselves. This will be about 4.5 minutes long.
I grew up in a small town in Arizona. I was in church from the day I was born. My family would attend church so often it seemed like it was a second home. My relationship with my youth pastor developed pretty normally. He became a youth leader in the church when I was, I'd say, a freshman, and I was pretty committed to my Christianity, to my walk with the Lord. I just loved going to youth group. I loved being involved. I eventually became the worship leader at our youth group. As we got to know each other, we went through different Bible studies. We became like family. It was the best thing you could ever imagine. I mean, he was the best friend I'd ever had. He was the safest person I'd ever been around. He was so fun, and it was great. One day, my youth pastor came to my house, and he just had a blank face. He said to me that he just needed a hug, and he just wanted to know that he was loved by someone. It was really strange. It was really awkward, and I didn't know what to do. I was left wondering, what's going on with my youth pastor? What's going on with this guy? He's my mentor. This guy's always been so strong, and why is he so messed up right now? What's going on? So he left, and then he came back about 20 to 30 minutes later, and he gave me this envelope, and it was thick, and I had no idea what was in it, and he just said, "Wesley, I want you to give this to my mom when you think the time is right." As I stood there with him, I asked him what was going on, and he told me that he was going to commit suicide. As he was taking off, I looked down, and in the passenger seat was a 6-shooter revolver. I called my friend, and we met at Taco Bell, and we talked. And we decided that we can't do anything, so we're going to call our parents. We eventually all decided to call the police. And the police searched all night for our youth pastor and eventually found him in a town about 50 miles north, sitting in his car with the gun in his hand. He got checked into a mental hospital. When he got out of the mental hospital, he convinced me that I needed to move out of my parents' house because my parents told me that I wasn't allowed to be around this guy if I wanted to live at their house. I told my parents that, I have to be there to encourage this guy. He would be there for me, and, I'm going to be there for him, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. So I moved out of my parents' house, and I moved in with a friend from the church. They tried to talk to me about it and tried to start pulling me away from this youth pastor and separating me from him. And I was not going to have any of that. what would happen is I would go over to this youth pastor's apartment that he had behind his parents' house, and I would go hang out with him just to spend time with him and to make sure that he wasn't too lonely. We would watch movies and we would hang out pretty often. We did all kinds of things together still. And there was one night where things were not normal and things were definitely inappropriate. One night we were watching a movie and I had fallen asleep. You know, I woke up to something that wasn't so pleasant. My youth pastor was abusing me. I had no idea what was going on. The next morning when I woke up, I thought it was just a bad dream, and I thought that I was going insane. It was like my world had fallen apart. I started asking myself, you know, am I gay now? Is there something wrong with me? What did I do to deserve this? Why is my best friend, my mentor, my youth pastor, someone that became more important to me than my own family? Why am I being betrayed like this? It really destroyed my relationship with God. It really did. Because I thought that God didn't care anymore, and I couldn't believe that he was good. What good God allows something like this to happen? In his church, to his children. The pain never stops. It never stops.
So we need to listen and believe abuse survivors. Develop an attentive environment that puts the molester at risk for being discovered rather than the most vulnerable at risk for being abused. Survivors are listening, whether or not they choose to share part of their story, all of their story, they are listening. I encourage you to, if you're a pastor, I encourage you to preach in appropriate ways about abuse prevention and the role that that has in a healthy ministry. Pray for survivors, whether or not you know any or not, during your sharing and prayer time. Have resources available for survivors when they do ask how they can work at their own healing and how they can walk in a safe community of faith. Still wonder why we need to be safer in our congregations? If you are a person who is logical and rational, well, here you go. It is required, safe church policies and best practices are required by most church liability insurances. They don't just want to see your policy, they also want to know that you're following it. Parents seek evidence of a prevention policy too, and best practices that will keep their children as safe as possible. And we all want to keep our vulnerable elders as safe from abuse as we can. So, how will we do this? How will we make our churches as safe as possible? Decrease isolation and secrecy, excuse me. You heard in the first video, the men seated at the table discussing safety and discussing abuse when it happens. We're talking about a particular classroom that had been moved into a more secluded part of the congregation, part of the building. And so we want to decrease isolation and secrecy. If there is, of necessity, a Sunday school room or a youth meeting room that is more isolated, then please have a rover. Have someone that it is their job and that they want to do it willingly to just walk around through all of the Sunday school rooms and just pay attention to what's going on. That is to increase supervision and accountability of what's going on in our churches during all parts of church life. And that leads to the other piece of this. If you have a rover, All activities should be observable and interruptible. There is no part of church life that cannot be interrupted for the sake of children, youth, and vulnerable adults. Now, mind you, having two unrelated adults is always the best policy. If I didn't say that, I want to make sure that is there. But if it just seems impossible, do something that still adds a level of accountability. And that's that rover who can interrupt any Sunday school class and say, hey, what are you talking about today? What are the stories of Jesus that are so important to you? And it's supportive to Sunday school teachers. And if someone is a would-be perpetrator, they will usually leave, because at that point they realize that nowhere is going to be a place that they can have access, unwatched, unmonitored access to children, youth, and vulnerable adults. I hope that you will provide education on personal, emotional, and physical boundaries. I have done a 25-minute video. You can find it on YouTube, or I'd be happy to send you the link, on basic boundaries to start a conversation in your congregation that's not just about sexual boundaries, but about how we can be together in healthy relationships. Again, it may be about that, what is mine to do and what is not mine. What is your, how can we define what is yours and what is mine? If that doesn't make sense to you, I would love to share that video with you to start a conversation about what boundaries, emotional, physical, sexual, and spiritual, look like. Provide education on appropriate touch. This video will start a conversation on that. We will cover healthy, unhealthy, and confusing touch tonight at this time. And your prevention policies should reflect all of these things on this slide. When it comes to preventing abuse, the most important things congregations can do is to create an environment of clear communication with each other, to have high behavioral expectations of each other, and to do this through education and prevention training. Here are several rules specific for youth workers or youth pastors so they may stay above reproach. The opposite sex rule. Be careful how much time you spend with the opposite sex, and do not spend time alone with a young person of the opposite sex. Do things in pairs, unrelated pairs of differing genders. The 5 years older rule. I broke that rule, or I didn't even know that rule when I was in seminary being a youth sponsor. I was 3 years older than some of the kids in that church. Certainly not 5 years older. And 5 years older, this discourages sponsors or youth pastors from confusing youth ministry with a potential dating pool, to put it very bluntly. The more time rule. Spending more time with the same young person, even if it is the same gender, may not be the best thing for that young person. As a matter of fact, it might be a sign of poor boundaries, at the least, not knowing what's yours to deal with, to take on in that young person's concerns, and what might be theirs to care and nurture. Or it could be a sign of grooming. If there is an adult who's spending an inordinate amount of time with the same young person, it could be a sign of grooming. No confidentiality rule. Absolutely. I tell everyone before they start to share more intimate pastoral care issues with me, that if they tell me they intend to harm themselves or someone else, that I will be required to share that with the appropriate authorities, with those who can help them. So no confidentiality rule with young adults or youth either. Transparency. As we said in the last slide, everything must be observable and interruptible. Be cautious about being alone with a young adult. Just keep everything above board. The no porn rule, you know, the possibility is that our youth might be watching porn on the internet, but there is no reason that a youth sponsor or youth pastor should need to watch it with them to tell them why it's wrong. And the no fear rule. Under 25, our brains are still developing, and we as young adults taking care of young people, you know, might have very little to fear. But youth ministry should not be an anything goes situation. If I'm going to take my young people to Chicago, I need to have safe practices in place. I need to have their medical card. I need to know what they're allergic to. I need to have a plan for how we would take care of an emergency. Parents need to have their contact information, all that good stuff. If I'm going to take my kids to the mountains, I want to have those kinds of specialized plans in place. It's not just an anything goes, no fear, go for it. This is not Nike. This is, you know, it is the church where we hope we can take care of our children in appropriate ways. Healthy and confusing touch. When you touch a child, what are you trying to express? What are your intentions? That's one question. What might be going on in that child's life? Some things you might know about that. And then there are other things that families keep close to the vest, particularly if we're talking about abuse or other things like that. So how might these things that we don't know about, how might those impact how the child receives your touch? That's the question. It is not about your good intentions when it comes to wanting to touch a child. I'll say it again. It is not about your good intentions, because I believe most of us listening to this video have good intentions. We want to show our care, but it's not about that. It's about how this child or this vulnerable adult might receive your touch. And that is influenced by what's happening in their lives and by what has happened in the past, and that what memories that touch might trigger. I'm going to tell you two stories, and they're hard. So this is a trigger warning for any survivors. Number one, I have a dear friend. That has said, please do not even touch me on the shoulder. Please don't touch me on the shoulder. When someone does that, I jump. I freak out. She clearly has trauma in her background. I share this account with you with her permission. It's, you know, otherwise we wouldn't think about that, right? It's just a shoulder. It's just a shoulder tap, a shoulder touch. But that's not, even if it's good intention, that's not good for her, because she is re-traumatized. She is re-triggered. And we don't know about that unless we ask, unless we find out more about the person's traumas, or there's other options. The receiver's experience of touch is influenced by what has happened in their lives, by what is happening in their lives, and by what difficult memories they have, traumatic memories that they're dealing with. Now, healthy touch is wonderful. Healthy touch leaves the receiver feeling affirmed and cared for, loved. Obviously, this seems like grandma and her granddaughter, and they are sharing a hug that is obviously good for both of them. They enjoy and are nurtured by those hugs. That's a wonderful thing. There there are examples of touch, like my friend, that are not healthy and that are in fact abusive. When a toucher takes advantage of the receiver may begin to feel bad about themselves. The receiver may spend years feeling ashamed. In this picture, there is an uncle and a nephew, seemingly. The sign on the wall on this cartoon says "Home Sweet Home," and the uncle is putting his hand closer and closer to his nephew's crotch. And the child doesn't say it out loud, but there's a thought bubble that says, "Uncle, stop." That's an example of unhealthy touch. And I will tell you another story about another dear friend of mine. Her father was a deacon in their small church, and he regularly sexually abused her. Sometimes, while he was abusing her, he quoted scripture. "You can be sure that my friend did not welcome any sort of touch. It was a hug or anything else that was triggering." And it took a while for that abuse to come to the surface. So that church had a predator in their midst who was a deacon. Touch. The receiver feels uncomfortable, uneasy, and confused. This picture probably is a picture of a mom and a son. We don't know why mom is doing the hug from his back. Technically speaking, she's not touching him in any place that's inappropriate physically, but he looks kind of confused. She looks unhappy. It's a very strange sort of situation. Now, what if this is not mom and a son, but what if this might be a Sunday school teacher or a faith formation leader and a child in their class? What if this boy had just told his Sunday school teacher that his grandpa had died and that he was very sad? And this was her response. The young man might be thinking to himself, why is she doing this? I thought she liked me. Oh, wait a minute. Does she like me? I thought she was married. This is making me feel freaked out. At the most, this is he's going to lose trust in his Sunday school teacher. At the least, it's going to complicate their relationship because he will wonder what she will do. And it becomes uncomfortable and confusing. How do we deal with this? We don't want our churches to become sterile, uncaring places where no one touches anybody. That's not the point. The point is, we want to allow for autonomy and joy. And how do we do that? We offer a choice. And this means give the child a choice. Give the youth a choice. Give the vulnerable adult a choice. Do you want a hug, a high five, a handshake? Or nothing today? Now, you don't have to have all those on your list. Do you want a hug? Do you want a handshake or nothing today? Or I think about some of our churches that laid off, did not do the passing of the peace for quite a while during COVID, but now we're back to that. How does our new awareness, it may not be a concern about abuse, but it may also be concern for passing on a bug, passing on a virus. And we want to be cautious about that too. I know sometimes when I've been around sick people and it's time for passing the peace, I simply do this. I will put my hand over my heart and kind of I'll often nod to the person and say, God be with you. And that it's clear, that I'm not putting my hand out for a hug or a handshake. Give a person a choice. You want a hug? You want a handshake or nothing today? And abide by that choice. It might feel a little uncomfortable for a while, but believe me, it gets better. And it certainly is for the benefit of everyone in our churches. That's what I want you to leave with. All right, 2 more topics. One is social media best practices. We are a very digitally engaged culture, and the church is no different. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. But if you want this PowerPoint, I can also make it available to you if your pastor or other leader asks for it. Approve a social media policy, distribute and follow it. If you don't even have any idea how to start with creating a social media policy, contact me and I'll get you a social media model. Initiate one-on-one communication via the internet with minors. And if a person under 18 should decide to contact you as an adult, note the date, the time, and the topic of any communication with that young person in a journal, in your phone, some way that you have a record of that. Ask parents permission ahead of time to communicate with their youth. It's usually done as a group, right? And again, if a young person should decide to reach out to you, record or copy the video, the text, or the post. Do not use a social media platform like Snapchat that has no way to save posts. Be aware of what the limitations are of any platforms that you use to communicate with minors on, and always have something that has a way to save posts. Continue the 2 unrelated adult rule during any online children or youth ministry, or if that's not possible, then at a minimum have a volunteer who will regularly review recordings or posts of ministry activities. Use ministry-based accounts, not personal ones, as much as possible to remind ourselves that this is indeed ministry, not just building a friendship. If youth reach out to an adult's personal account, again, respond and report that contact and your journal of that contact to your Safe Sanctuaries chair or your deacon or whoever is caring for safe sanctuary policy and procedure. Create a schedule, inform parents so they know when the account is in use and when it will be monitored. And again, even in a virtual activity, maintain a 5-year gap rule. Young adults online with youth should be at least 23 years old. We do not want social media to become a temptation to play the field either. This is ministry, not potential dating pool. Staff and volunteers working with minors are to use their own names. If it's not possible to use your name, to determine who is keeping a record of all the handles or usernames. Document who is attending online activities as you would any in-person ones. Do not post pictures or videos of minors without parental permission, and never, ever post names of kids online. We do not want to give perpetrators any easier access to our children. Just a few safer practices for protecting our vulnerable adults. I hope that you will host a training for deacons or other pastoral care folks on recognizing all forms of abuse and exploitation of vulnerable adults, so you recognize what might be happening, including financial exploitation. Know where to report elder abuse if you see it. Utilize same basic safe sanctuary practices with vulnerable adults as you would with children and youth. It's why they are considered vulnerable. If we are visiting our vulnerable adults, again, the best practice is to have two unrelated people going together. They get to see two people from the church, and it's a good thing for both care as well as for protection for that adult and you from unfounded allegations. And never visit behind closed bedroom doors. You can close, of course, you need to close a door if the person is in a one-room nursing home, but of course, then having two unrelated people is obviously very important. Transportation of a vulnerable adult by two unrelated people is obviously the best practice, again, but if that's impossible, inform the person who has their power of attorney of your travel plans with Google Maps or other internet mapping apps. It's easy for the power of attorney person to say, oh yes, you're headed to that doctor. It takes so and so long. I will expect to hear from you when you get to the clinic. Again, it's another way of holding accountability and protecting all parties. Pastors should not be executors or beneficiaries of someone's will. Most pastors have good intentions. We don't want to create a precedent for someone who would not have good intentions. And it just is not a good practice to have someone have access to a vulnerable adult's resources who are not in the family. Pastors should only receive token gifts and report to deacons any gifts outside of the normal range of Christmas or birthday gifts, for instance. Most churches have a gift-giving culture that most of us recognize. And so we also recognize when gifts are outside of that range of normal. So pastors should be responsible, should be accountable if they receive something outside of that norm. And if others see that pastors are receiving gifts or giving gifts that are outside of the norm, that needs to be paid attention to, because that could be a sign of grooming if it's accompanied by other behavior. And then ask if the vulnerable adult would welcome a hug, a handshake, or nothing today. Thank you so much. If you have stuck with me through this video, these are the summary goals that we hope for a safer church, to keep our relationships healthy and clear as followers of Jesus, to practice healthy touch with permission, to protect our youth workers from unfounded allegations, to protect children, youth, and vulnerable adults from abuse, and to create and maintain a survivor-centered church culture. All of these are ways that we will promise to protect others to the best of our ability, and that we will provide a healing place for those who need to begin that journey. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this can be the beginning of a conversation in your congregation. And if you're left with questions or concerns, you are welcome to contact me. You can email me at Kathy, KATHYND, at mennowdc.org, Kathy ND at mennowdc.org, or call Western District Conference Office at 316-283-6300. You may also talk with your own conference minister, presently Heidi and Sandra and myself. So we would be glad to have further conversation about issues of safety, protection, and responding to allegations in healthier ways. Thanks again. God bless you.